Hi students, welcome to lesson number 7 on Marx on Peasantry. The objectives of this lesson. This lesson discusses the writings of Marx on peasants, his views on the peasants, the central ambivalence in his theory. It considers Marx's relevant writings on Asia, ancient Greece and Rome, European feudalism and more specifically England, France and Russia. It also attempts to account for the development of his views over time. The objective is to put the notorious epigrams and passages in his full context of his thought. Now, Marx on the peasants. In analyzing the perspective for sociologists in France and Germany, Marx noted that in countries where the peasantry constituted a majority of the population, the peasant held the power to decide whether or not the proletariat could win and keep power. Wherever the peasants were solidly conservative, then the proletariat would not be able to hold power indefinitely. But in Germany, the peasants were fighting the feudal aristocracy on their own account to establish freehold land rights and rid agriculture of feudal restriction. Thus, the peasantry were waging the bourgeois revolution. The proletariat accordingly must win the support of the peasantry in the proletarian struggle against capitalism by supporting the peasant struggle against feudalism. The two battles must be synchronized for either ally to win its aims, but clearly a common struggle would include contradictory elements and socialism could not be won unless the proletariat was clearly the leader of the struggle. The leadership of the proletariat was essential because the nature of the peasantry made it impossible for it to lead, and in any case the peasants were aiming at ends not necessarily consistent with the achievement of proletarian aims. So, what was this nature of this peasantry? Perhaps Marx's best known outline of an answer to this question in relation to the small French peasantry occurs in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, and it is worth quoting at same length. The small peasants form a vast mass, the members of which live in similar conditions, but without entering into manifold relations with one another. Their mode of production isolates them from one another. Instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse, the isolation is increased by France's bad means of communication and by the poverty of the peasants. Their field of production, the small holding, admits of no division of labor in its cultivation, no application of science and therefore no multiplicity of development, no diversity of talent, no wealth of social relationships. Each individual peasant family is almost self-sufficient. It itself directly produces the major parts of its consumption and thus acquires its means of life more through exchange with nature than is intercourse with society. Insofar as millions of families live under economic conditions of existence that divide their mode of life, their interest and their culture from those of other classes and put them in hostile contrast to the latter. They form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection among these small peasants and the identity of their interest begets no unity, no national union and no political organization. They do not form a class. They are consequently incapable of enforcing their class interest in their own names, whether through a parliament or through a convention. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. It is true that we cannot jump directly from this description of the small French peasantry in the middle of the 19th century. A peasantry with half a century's experience of relatively unfettered private ownership of land to the rest of the world's rural population at all times and places, but certain key aspects of the conditions of material existence of virtually all peasants are outlined in this quotation, and it is these aspects which underlie the Marxist position. Now, we will understand the nature of peasant life. The peasants are isolated from the national society, isolated physically in villages which have little consistent need for continuous communication both with each other and with the cities. At most, the peasant is likely to be aware of his district within which members of his own family meet or secure marriage partners and the local district town. Perhaps the source of the merchants would buy his crops, the marketplace, the site of the police station and so on. The peasant is dependent almost entirely upon himself and his family for his way of life. He is not part of, or at least is not aware of, a complex interdependent national division of labor. Since there is little division of labor outside the family, there is little specialization, and as a result production is primitive. The peasant is poor. The culture and technical resources of the village are most backward. The peasant's important relationships are not to a wider economy of which he sees himself as a constituent part, but rather to nature, to the rhythms, to the arbitrariness of soil, weather and season. The production unit is the family and personal relationship, and thus also production relationships. Family relationships rather than competence and technical specialization determine the primitive division of labor within the family. That is, the relationship between man and wife, between man and his eldest son, his youngest son, his aged father and so on. And the production relationships exaggerate and intensify the family relationships. The desperate family feuds within the village exhibit the intensity generated within what is simultaneously the basic personal production and property unit. The rural family embodies all the exploitative relationship of the wider society, and it is a peasant household father who is of necessity the agent for the worst form of exploitation of the members of his own family. The agent which sustained all that is worst in pre-capitalist society in terms of personal relationship. The violence locked up in the family is matched by the violence between families. The violence intrinsic in the gross subordination of the peasantry as a whole. Thus, if achieving a socialist revolution were merely a function of the savagery of exploitation, then undoubtedly the peasantry would always have preeminently qualified for the role of agency of the revolution. But revolution requires also collective organization, a mass division of labor, a concentration of advanced technical and political abilities. And it is these which the peasantry, by the nature of its way of life, cannot produce. It cannot as a class produce the abilities required to operate a society with a collective division of labor. It can only duplicate the ideal of its own members, the small peasant holding. The aim of peasants rebels thus becomes not the advance of society as a whole, but no more than a just sharing of a common poverty. This is certainly egalitarianism, but it is the egalitarianism of communalists, of independent identical participants, not the egalitarianism of collectivists, of interdependent people organized in a social division of labor. The peasantry cannot as a class constitute itself the ruling class in order to realize the full economic potentialities of society. On the contrary, it can on its own only drag society backward into poverty of the past. Now, the Marx views on the worker-peasant alliance. In countries where peasants are a majority of the population, Marxists have had to formulate what should be the relationship between the proletarian struggle and the peasantry. Marx himself always supported the small peasant struggle against large feudal owners, a constant element of the bourgeois revolution. But he opposed the struggle of small property owners against large capitalist concern, a counter revolution. Large scale capitalist enterprise had to be preserved for collective ownership, for it was the source from which the wealth of socialist society would come. When the proletariat begins its battle against capitalism, making socialism for it the first time possible, a large scale production was not to be broken up among the producers. In the 1850 program for the Communist League in Germany, Marx proposed that the royal and large feudal estates should not be distributed to the peasants, but preserved under state ownership. Similarly, the Bolshevik program in Tsarist Russia demanded the nationalization of commercially important landed estates, not their redistribution among the peasants. In this, Bolsheviks went flatly against the demand both of the peasants and their main political champions, the social revolutionaries. In the event, the Bolshevik program was irrelevant since the peasants just seized the land and the Bolsheviks could do little about it except ratify the seizure. But in seizing the land, the peasantry created a new class of owners of private property. It was an albatross around the neck of the Soviet regime. The regime only fed itself by Stalin's final solution of the peasant question. The complete destruction of the peasantry in collectivization, implicit in both Marx and Lenin writing, is a stress upon the inconsistent aims of peasant and proletariat, their different targets. Many popular sociologists have refused to accept this sharp distinction, even though the distinction is a crucial line between libertarian socialism and the autocratic state socialism, which occur when outsiders ride the back of the people into power. Since the peasants are not a national class for themselves, they cannot control their own leaders. They must be represented. When these leaders are intent on ends other than those of the peasants, ends such as industrialization, national unity, and so on, the populists can be the worst dictators of all. Thus, the distinction between peasants and proletarian is not a pedantic aside, a place of irrelevant sectarianism. It defines different roads to different things. Lenin was particularly emphatic in stressing the difference in refusing to muddle all the issue in the people. He constantly criticized the social revolutionaries for doing just. For example, in 1909, he wrote of the social revolutionary program that the fundamental idea of the program is not at all that an alliance of the proletariat and the peasantry is necessary, but that there is no class abyss between the former and the latter, and that there is no need to draw a line of class demarcation between them, and that the Marxist idea of the petty bourgeois nature of the peasantry that distinguishes it from the proletariat is fundamentally false. The peasant movement was indeed fighting, but not capital relationships so much as pre-capitalist relationship. The complete victory of the peasant movement will not abolish capitalism. On the contrary, it will create a broader foundation for its development. This does not mean that peasants will not play an important role in the battle for socialism, but the role is only possible under leadership from the proletariat. Without that leadership, the peasant struggle leads to other things. We must support peasant movement to the end, but we must remember that it is a movement of another class, not the one that can or will accomplish socialism. One of Marx's more important piece of political writing is the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte in the year 1851. Here we will try to understand Marx's analysis of the causes of the specific nature of peasant political consciousness leading to the election of Napoleon III. The small holding peasants form an enormous mass whose members live in a similar condition, but without entering into manifold relationship with each other. Their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. The isolation is furthered by France's poor means of communication and the poverty of the peasants. Their field of production, the small holdings, permits no division of labor in its cultivation, no application of science, and therefore no multifariousness of development, no diversity of talent, no wealth of social relationships. Each individual peasant family is almost self-sufficient, directly produce most of its consumer needs, and thus acquire its means of life more through an exchange with nature than in intercourse with society. A small holding, the peasant and his family, besides it another small holding, another peasant and another family. A few score of these constitute a village, and a few score villages constitute a department. Thus, the great mass of the French nation is found by this addition of homologous magnitudes, much as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. Insofar as millions of families live under conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interest in the culture from those of the other classes, and put them in hostile oppositions to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection among these small holding peasants, and the identity of their interests forms no community, no national bond, and no political organization among them. They do not constitute a class. They are therefore incapable of asserting their class interest in their own name, whether through a parliament or a convention. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Their representativeness must at the same time appear as a master, as an authority over them, an unlimited governmental power which protects them from the other classes and sends them rain and sunshine from above. The political influence of the small holding peasants therefore finds its final expression in the executive power which dominates society to itself. This is particularly interesting analysis of the social psychology of group solidarity, and one that has contemporary significance as well. It sheds a lot of light on how Marx thinks about the formation of class consciousness, even as it significantly misunderstands the agency of rural poor. Now, what are the limitations of the French peasantry according to Marx? He says that they are isolated, burdened, unsophisticated, primitive, apolitical, and ignorant of their larger forces around them. Therefore, Marx says they cannot constitute a unified and purposive political force. From the description, we can draw several positive ideas about the foundation of collective solidarity. Here are the elements that Marx takes to be crucial in the formation of collective consciousness and is found in this passage. It says that the group needs to possess manifold relations to each other. There needs to be effective communication and transportation across space, not just local interaction. There needs to be a degree of economic interdependence. There need to be shared material conditions in the system of production. There needs to be an astute appreciation of the social and economic environment. There needs to be organization and leadership to help articulate a shared political consciousness and agenda. And Marx seems to have something like a necessary and sufficient relation in mind between these conditions and the emergence of collective consciousness. These conditions are jointly sufficient and individually necessary for collective consciousness in an extended group. So, there are several crucial ideas here that survive into current thinking about solidarity and mobilization. So, Marx's thinking about collective consciousness was persistent. It is interesting to consider where his thoughts about collective solidarity came from. How did he come to have insightful ideas about the social psychology and mobilization and solidarity in the first place? This isn't a topic that had a history of advanced theory and thinking in 1851. Two sources seemed likely. First is a tradition of French socialist thought in which Marx was immersed in the 1840s. French socialist thinkers were in fact interested in the question of how a revolutionary spirit came to be among a group of people. And second is Marx's own experience of working people in Paris in 1843 to 45. He writes of his own observations of working people in the economic and philosophic manuscripts in 1844. When communist artisans associate with one another, theory, propaganda, etc. is their first end. But at the same time, as a result of this association, they acquire a new need, the need for society, and what appears as a means becomes an end. In this practical process, the most splendid results are to be observed whenever French socialist workers are seen together. Such things as smoking, drinking, eating, etc. are no longer means of contact or means that bring them together. Association, society and conversation, which again has association as its ends, are enough for them. The brotherhood of man is no mere phrase with them, but a fact of life, and the nobility of man shines upon us from their work-hardened bodies. Here Marx gives as much importance to the substantial relationship of friendship and everyday association as it does to shared material interest in the formation of the class consciousness. Now, we look at the views of others on Marx. Marx's understanding of the political capacity and consciousness of peasant communities has been noted by many scholars of rural revolutions. One among them is James Scott, and he once opened a public lecture on the revolutions of the 20th century by saying that his lecture would only treat the peasant revolution of the century. But he then paused and laughed and said that this isn't much of a limitation because they were all peasant revolutions. Marx's assumption that only urban workers were capable of revolutionary consciousness was a serious misreading of the coming century of anti-capitalist and anti-colonial struggles. To summarize, the peasant masses were, in Marx's conception, a partly inarticulate remnant of pre-capitalist society, a bag of potatoes, not yet class, but gradually becoming so. Insofar as millions of families live under economic conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interest and their culture from those of the other classes and put them in hostile opposition to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection among these small holding peasants and the identity of their interest begets no community, no national bond and no political organization among them. They do not form a class. The abstract scheme of class formation does not, however, tells us to which category the peasants as such belongs. There is in Marxism, as we suggested above, a tendency to let the peasantry disappear into amorphous middle classes, being only slightly identifiable as a transitional remnant of pre-capitalist society. But historic political analysis necessarily have had to qualify this conceptual indistinctiveness.